Power can decay in many forms, but few so hideous as the death of King Philip II of Spain. For a ruler who had once held dominion over half the known world, his ultimate adversary was not rival monarchs or disobedient subjects, but something far more treacherous: his own decomposing body. As we step into the dim corridors of the Escorial Palace during the summer of 1598, we enter a tale where absolute authority collides with absolute fragility, where the ruler of empires becomes the prey of decay, and nature itself delivers its most merciless verdict upon the arrogance of kings. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to Rotten Ages, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's fascinating to think how people from every corner of the planet gather here, drawn by the same dark pages of history. Philip II of Spain stood as the most dominant sovereign of his century, the ruler of the first truly global empire, master of lands stretching from the Americas to the Philippines, which still carry his name. The son of Emperor Charles V, his realm spanned oceans and continents, earning him the proud phrase that the sun never sets upon his dominions. As the unwavering defender of Catholic orthodoxy during the Counter-Reformation, he was both venerated and dreaded, dispatching his mighty armada against England, and financing bloody wars against Protestant heretics throughout Europe. Yet, for all his vast might, Philip's last battle would unfold not on a distant field, but within the stifling walls of his own chamber. For 52 days beneath the oppressive Spanish summer, the man who had commanded fleets and armies was rendered motionless, trapped inside his own decaying flesh, consumed alive by creatures smaller than the tiniest of his subjects. This is not merely a chronicle of physical agony, though that agony was immense, but a reflection on the limits of human authority, the certainty of mortality, and the cruel equality of decay. The Escorial Palace, commissioned by Philip as both royal residence and mausoleum, would indeed become his tomb, but only after serving as the stage for his long and harrowing final act. Within those cold stone walls, a monarch accustomed to shaping the destiny of nations found himself helpless before the ceaseless assault of disease and vermin. Eyewitnesses to his last weeks left records so appalling that later generations assumed them exaggerated. Yet modern medical analysis has shown they were not. What follows is the genuine account of King Philip II's horrifying end, a death so prolonged, revolting and humiliating, that it stands as a memento mori for all ages. As we lift the royal sheets to reveal the corruption beneath, we are reminded that, in the end, even kings turn to dust, sometimes while still breathing, sometimes little by little, sometimes as banquets for the lowest creatures of creation. The first signs of Philip's downfall appeared in the spring of 1598. At 71, the king was already old by the standards of his age, and had long battled chronic illnesses. Gout had tormented him since his 30s, twisting his fingers and toes into crooked shapes that made walking and writing torturous. Each year the attacks came more often, and with greater fury, spreading from his joints to his knees, wrists and shoulders. He also suffered from crippling arthritis, so severe that courtiers said he could not move a hand or foot, not even to scratch his head. Combined with recurring fevers, these afflictions had already confined him to a wheelchair by 1591. Yet his legendary diligence persisted. Philip continued to examine every important document, personally, sometimes writing a simple no in the margin, a single word that could alter the fate of thousands. But by June 1598, his condition took a drastic turn for the worse. A new wave of fever left him delirious and weak, and soon abscesses began forming on his right knee and hand. These pustules would rupture, drain and reappear, each time larger and more painful. His physicians, bound by the primitive medical knowledge of their era, prescribed poultices and bloodletting, but the infection advanced without mercy. Within weeks the ruler of Spain was bedridden, able only to move his head and left arm. The greatest monarch in Christendom was now completely reliant on his attendants for every bodily function. The rigid etiquette that had made his court the most formal in Europe dissolved under the demands of his frailty. The man once approached only through elaborate gestures of reverence now lay helpless, often fouled in his own waste when servants failed to change his bedding quickly enough. As July's heat swelled, so too did Philip's torment. The abscesses spread over his chest, groin, and legs. From these open wounds emanated a foul stench so unbearable that even the most faithful attendants struggled to remain nearby. The reek of rotting flesh filled the palace corridors, forcing courtiers to press perfumed cloths to their noses when passing the royal suite. Philip, still lucid enough to grasp the horror of his condition, commanded the windows be shut, not for his comfort, but so the odor would not offend those outside. Chroniclers wrote that his skin was covered with pustules that oozed blood and matter, healing only to fester again. These sores became fertile ground for something far worse. As the king lay immobilized, unable to shift his position without excruciating pain, his sweat-drenched sheets created a perfect breeding ground for infestation. The first lice appeared in early August, whether carried in by a servant or born from the foul bedding. They found in Philip's body a paradise, warm, damp and defenseless. They multiplied swiftly, feeding on his blood and the decaying tissue of his lesions. Soon witnesses reported that lice swarmed over him in such numbers that no cleaning could keep pace. Diego de Epes, the royal confessor, later recorded that the insects seemed to breed inside the wounds themselves, emerging from the rotting flesh. Whether literally true or merely the impression of horrified observers, the result was the same. The most powerful man in Europe had become a living hive of vermin. Special attendants were said to be assigned solely to remove lice, scooping them off by the handful only to find new swarms by evening. But the lice were only the beginning. Beneath the surface, greater horrors stirred. Royal physician Andres Zamudio de Alfaro observed that the king's sores had begun to produce putrid and corrupted matter, within which many maggots were engendered. The larvae, common flies that had entered through the palace windows, had laid their eggs within the open wounds, feeding on the royal flesh as it decayed. Picture the sight. A man once believed to be divinely anointed, whose touch was thought to heal disease, now watching worms writhe beneath his skin and crawl out through his lesions. Each day, servants cleaned the maggots away, only for new ones to appear the next morning. Philip, conscious and resigned, clung ever tighter to his Catholic faith, reportedly saying, "Lord, these torments are heavy upon me, yet they are small compared to my sins." By the end of August, new afflictions compounded his misery. The constant pressure of immobility produced massive bed sores, particularly on his right hip and lower back. These ulcers, worsened by sweat and soiled linens, grew until the skin, fat and muscle gave way, exposing bare bone. Chronicler Fray Juan de San Jeronimo wrote that one sore was so deep one could see into the very cavity of his body. The attendants removed foul material from it daily, enough to fill 2 silver basins. This monstrous wound became the chief nest for maggots, which multiplied faster than they could be cleared away. Some reports claimed the larvae burrowed deeper when disturbed, literally eating the king alive from within. The flies that laid them grew bolder. Drawn to the stench, they began to invade his mouth, nose and ears. Unable to move, the once mighty monarch could only endure as insects crawled across his face and disappeared into his orifices. Some historians believe he developed myiasis, a condition in which living larvae infest multiple sites in the body. Adding to this catalogue of torment was Philip's worsening gout, which made even the faintest touch upon his limbs unbearable. Yet his frail body still required cleaning and repositioning. Each time the attendants tried to shift him or replace the soiled sheets, his screams echoed through the stone corridors of the Escorial. The ruler who had once watched heretics burn without flinching, now begged for pity from his own servants. Throughout this ghastly ordeal, Philip's mind remained largely clear, a cruel irony, for he could fully comprehend his degradation. The king who had built the magnificent Escorial as a monument to Spain's glory and his own divine authority, now lay decomposing within its chambers, conscious of every humiliation his body endured. Despite the agony, he displayed remarkable composure in matters of faith. He insisted on daily mass within his quarters, and requested that passages from religious texts be read aloud. The same man who had enforced Catholic orthodoxy across continents clung steadfastly to his devotion, even as his body turned into a stage for suffering. Between waves of pain, he still discussed matters of state and the future of his empire with his son and heir, the young Prince Philip, soon to be Philip III. By early September, new and dreadful symptoms emerged. Persistent diarrhea, likely from intestinal infection or the harsh medicines prescribed, further exhausted him and deepened the filth around his bed. His kidneys began to fail, causing his legs and abdomen to swell grotesquely with fluid. The stretched, inflamed skin split open in new places, offering yet more entry points for infection and infestation. Court physician Garcia de At documented that the monarch now suffered from violent fevers, accompanied by delirium, almost certainly signs of sepsis. Yet even in moments of clarity, Philip's thoughts turned toward his faith. He repeatedly asked for a particular crucifix, the same one that had rested in the hands of his father, Emperor Charles V, at the hour of death. Holding that relic seemed to soothe him, a tangible reminder of the imperial legacy he was about to join. But the treatments imposed by his doctors only deepened his misery. Guided by humoral theory, They applied caustic ointments to his ulcers in a futile attempt to rebalance his bodily fluids. These mixtures, containing mercury and arsenic among other poisons, burned his flesh and hastened the necrosis already consuming him. Bloodletting, sometimes performed daily, drained his strength further when his body most needed it. In those final weeks, Philip could take only thin broths, watered wine, and soft bread, when he could eat at all. The combined toll of infection, parasites, blood loss, and malnutrition drove his body toward collapse. His heart, strained to exhaustion, began to falter. He complained of pounding palpitations and difficulty breathing. Even the weather seemed to conspire against him. The summer of 1598 was unusually hot across central Spain, and the Escorial's thick granite walls trapped the heat like a furnace. The sweltering air accelerated the breeding of flies and lice that plagued the dying king, hastening the decomposition of his wounded flesh. The windows, kept mostly closed to hide the stench from those outside, allowed almost no breeze to ease his feverish skin, or disperse the miasma of decay that hovered over his bed like a shroud. By the second week of September, the end was clearly near. Though racked with pain, Philip's mind still flickered with clarity. He summoned his children to receive his blessing. The sight of their father, emaciated, infested and reeking of death, was too much for most to bear. His son, the future Philip III, who had been shielded from the worst, was struck with horror. Witnesses claimed the young prince had to leave the room several times, unable to endure the stench or the sight of his father's ravaged body. In one last effort to fulfill his duty as king, Philip tried to offer his heir advice. Weakly raising his hand toward his ruined form, he warned the prince about the fragility of earthly power. On the 13th of September 1598, Philip requested the final sacraments. His confessor administered extreme unction, carefully anointing what few parts of the royal body could be touched without provoking shrieks of agony. During the ritual, witnesses noted that flies continued to settle on the holy oil, drawn by the overwhelming odor of putrefaction. Incense could not mask it. The scene was almost symbolic, a fusion of sanctity and corruption that would have fascinated a Vanitas painter. As the priests murmured prayers, the king's breathing grew heavier and more uneven. Fluid filled his lungs, a final act in the slow collapse of his organs. His exhalations rattled in his throat, carrying the foul scent of inner decay. At 5 o'clock on the morning of September 13th, after asking for the crucifix to be laid upon his chest, Philip II of Spain exhaled for the last time. The monarch who had ruled the wealth of the New World, and the mightiest army in Europe, had been conquered at last by the smallest of enemies. The task of preparing the royal corpse proved nearly impossible. Conventional embalming methods could not be applied. The body was already decomposing beyond control. When attendants tried to lift him, parts of the flesh tore away. The royal embalmers worked quickly, pouring immense quantities of perfume, spices, and preservatives in a desperate attempt to make the remains suitable for public display. Even so, the body continued to deteriorate. The funeral had to be shortened. Only the essential rites were carried out before the sealed casket was hurriedly placed in the royal crypt beneath the Escorial. There, beside his father and several wives, Philip II was finally hidden from sight, his physical corruption buried, though his reputation for suffering would endure. News of the king's horrifying death spread swiftly across Europe. The reactions were as divided as the continent itself. In Protestant England and the Netherlands, where Philip had been regarded as a tyrant and butcher, the reports were greeted with grim satisfaction. Pamphlets proclaimed his demise as divine justice for the cruelties of the Inquisition and the massacres of the Dutch Revolt. Queen Elizabeth I of England, his longtime foe, is said to have remarked upon hearing of his end, "We must not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our shared mortality." In Catholic lands, however, especially in Spain, the story was softened. Official chronicles downplayed the grotesque details, describing instead a pious monarch who met death with serene dignity. The public was told that their king had died as he had lived, a model of faith and fortitude. Medical historians now suggest that Philip's ordeal stemmed from a combination of chronic diseases. His lifelong gout likely evolved into rheumatoid arthritis, severely weakening his immune system, combined with possible diabetes, implied by his extreme thirst and swelling. This made him vulnerable to severe infections. The recurring pustules and abscesses were probably the result of systemic staphylococcal infection, while his immobility produced massive pressure ulcers that allowed maggot infestation. What makes Philip's case particularly infamous is not merely the scale of his agony, but the symbolism it carried. His body became a grotesque parody of the empire he had ruled. vast, powerful, yet rotting from within. The monarch who had condemned thousands to die for faith could not command the vermin to leave his flesh. The sovereign who had sent fleets across oceans could not command his own failing organs to obey, as the historian William H. Prescott later observed. No degree of power or wealth can purchase exemption from the physical laws to which all mortals are bound. Philip's death, then, stands not only as a gruesome curiosity of medical history, but as a profound reminder of power's frailty. His body, consumed by parasites and rot, became the ultimate symbol of humanity's equality in decay. The monarch who had once ruled half the world was now indistinguishable, in his suffering, from the humblest peasant. Death, indifferent and democratic, had reduced all distinctions to the same foul end. It is impossible to ignore the moral resonance that this scene carried for those who witnessed or later chronicled it. To many observers, the king's physical disintegration appeared almost allegorical, a punishment for pride and persecution. Philip II, the great defender of faith, had been forced to endure a death that mocked the very doctrines of divine protection and royal sanctity he had so zealously upheld. His own body became a sermon on the vanity of earthly glory. Those around him could not help but interpret his torment through the lens of divine justice. The man who had sent thousands to the stake now lay consumed by invisible fire. The ruler who had built monasteries and sponsored missions across the globe found himself abandoned to silence and insects. No heavenly miracle intervened. The God in whom he had placed absolute trust remained silent as decay performed its merciless work. For the Spanish Empire, the passing of its most formidable sovereign marked more than the end of a reign. It heralded the beginning of decline. Philip's son and successor, Philip III, lacked his father's relentless discipline and administrative obsession. Where the elder Philip had micromanaged every decree, his heir preferred delegation and leisure. Within a generation, Spain's mighty empire began to unravel. Territories slipped away, its economy weakened, and its influence waned. The vast machine of bureaucracy and devotion that Philip II had constructed could not survive without the will that had sustained it. Historians have long speculated that witnessing his father's prolonged death left deep scars on the young prince. The sight of the once invincible monarch reduced to a helpless, pest-ridden corpse may have convinced him of the futility of power itself. Philip III would govern through favorites and advisors, avoiding the direct burdens of kingship. In doing so, he inadvertently accelerated the empire's decline. The Escorial Palace, conceived by Philip II as a fortress of faith, intellect and authority, gradually transformed into something else entirely. Its vast courtyards and shadowed corridors became less a seat of command than a monument to mortality. The very architecture, austere and symmetrical, seemed designed to remind future generations of both divine eternity and human transience. It was the stone embodiment of the paradox that had consumed its creator, grandeur built to house decay. Today the Escorial still stands outside Madrid, its grey spires rising against the Castilian sky. Visitors who walk its echoing halls are told stories of devotion, piety, and royal discipline, but rarely the full horror of what transpired in those upper chambers in the summer of 1598. Guides speak of Philip's steadfast faith and political legacy, glossing over the stench, the lice, the maggots, and the unrelenting screams. Yet the truth lingers in the air like the scent of incense after a funeral. For those who know the details, that palace becomes more than a monument to Spanish power, it becomes a shrine to its disintegration. The very stones seem to whisper of the king, who could command everything except his own body. The marble floors on which courtiers once knelt now recall the dragging of soiled sheets, the hum of flies, the murmured prayers for a death that would not come. In this sense, Philip's demise transcends history and enters the realm of myth, a cautionary tale of empire devoured from within. His story encapsulates the fragility of all civilizations that mistake endurance for immortality. Just as his flesh yielded to rot, so too would the empire he had built begin to crumble, eaten away not by external enemies, but by its own stagnation and excess. Contemporaries who chronicled his final days often struggled to describe them without moral judgment. Some, like the friar José de Sigüenza, tried to frame his agony as a divine test, a purification of the soul before entering paradise. Others saw it differently. To them, the endless infestations and corruption of the body seemed less like sanctification and more like retribution. The most Catholic king had died like a sinner, whose body bore witness to the corruption of his soul. Whatever interpretation one chooses, there is no denying the symbolic power of his death. The man who had devoted his life to defending Catholic orthodoxy ended his days trapped in a grotesque parody of martyrdom, suffering not for faith, but from the very nature he had sought to transcend. In his stillness, in his rotting majesty, he embodied the fate that awaits every empire, the slow collapse of flesh and order alike. Even the art of later centuries seemed to echo this theme. Painters of the Baroque and Romantic eras returned again and again to the image of the dying king. In their canvases, light fell upon the crucifix in his hands while darkness devoured the rest of the scene. The divine and the mortal met in a single gesture, the trembling of fingers clinging to faith as the body surrendered to ruin. Such imagery became part of the Spanish cultural psyche, grandeur inseparable from decay, piety intertwined with suffering. Yet there was also something deeply human about Philip's endurance. For all his flaws, he faced his death without renouncing his beliefs or his sense of duty. He continued to read reports, issue commands, and plan the succession even as worms ate his flesh. The duality of the man, a tyrant and a believer, a ruler and a victim, makes his final chapter hauntingly complex. He was both the architect of cruelty and its ultimate recipient. In the centuries that followed, writers and philosophers would return to his story as a meditation on the futility of control. The Stoics might have admired his composure, theologians pondered his apparent punishment, and later historians saw in him a mirror of Spain's fall. Each interpretation, though shaped by its time, circles the same truth that no human structure, political, religious, or physical, can resist the entropy that governs all things. Thus, Philip II's death did more than close an era. It opened a philosophical wound that Spain and Europe would probe for generations. The idea that divine favor could coexist with such degradation challenged the entire concept of sacred monarchy. If even the most Catholic king could be consumed by corruption, what did that say about divine order? What indeed did it say about humanity's place in the universe? Even within the court itself, whispers spread after his burial. Some servants claimed the Escorial remained haunted by the king's groans, heard echoing through the halls on sweltering summer nights. Others swore that the smell of decay persisted long after the body had been sealed away, an invisible reminder that power leaves traces, not all of them noble. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the spiritual residue of his passing cannot be dismissed. The Escorial's somber atmosphere, its chill air and endless corridors, seem to preserve that final summer like a memory caught in stone. Every visitor who pauses before the royal crypt participates, in some small way, in that centuries-old meditation on pride, faith and decay. Philip's legacy, however, endured in ways even he might have dreaded. The grandeur of his empire faded, but the story of his death persisted, repeated in taverns, retold in sermons, revived in books and paintings. The king who had once controlled history became its captive. His final days, meticulously recorded, became a spectacle for generations that would outlive his conquests and his faith alike. It is in that endurance of decay remembered, of power stripped bare, that the true meaning of his death resides. For centuries after, his name evoked both majesty and corruption, devotion and cruelty. The paradox of Philip II remains unresolved, his empire gone, his monuments weathered, his faith absorbed by time, but his death, raw and human, remains indelible. Centuries later, Philip II's death continues to disturb and fascinate. It stands as one of history's most vivid lessons in the collapse of power, an emperor consumed not by rebellion or sword, but by the quiet, relentless forces of nature he could not command. His reign had been devoted to imposing order upon chaos, the chaos of heresy, of politics, of the world itself. Yet in his final days, it was that same chaos, microbial, unseen, inevitable, that conquered him completely. His passing also transformed how future generations viewed monarchy itself. In life, Philip had embodied the ideology of divine kingship, the belief that rulers stood halfway between God and man. In death, that illusion shattered. His body, crawling with vermin, became the ultimate denial of divine privilege. No coronation oil can preserve the flesh against the rot of mortality. For moralists and philosophers alike, this vision was irresistible. The irony was too perfect. The most Catholic king reduced to a festering spectacle of earthly corruption. To the faithful, it was a trial of purification. To skeptics, divine mockery. Theologians debated whether his torment had expiated his sins or exposed his pride. In either reading, Philip's death became a sermon written in flesh, a warning to all who mistook grandeur for grace. The Enlightenment thinkers who came later viewed him differently still. To them, Philip represented the fatal marriage of faith and absolutism, of dogma elevated to governance. His death, stripped of its theological trappings, revealed the consequences of fanatic control, a man imprisoned not only in his palace, but in his certainties. He had sought to conquer the world for God, and ended conquered by his own decaying body. The worms that consumed him did not distinguish between Catholic and heretic. They were nature's truest republic. Even the romantic writers of the 19th century, drawn to ruins and tragedy, found poetry in his suffering. To them, Philip's agony embodied the sublime, a beauty born of horror, the grandeur of ruin itself. In their imaginations, the Escorial became both palace and tomb, a monument to ambition punished by eternity. To the candle flickering beside his crucifix, became the symbol of a dying faith, burning bright even as it melted away. Yet beyond all interpretation, the historical fact remains stark. Philip II, master of half the globe, died as little more than a carcass still conscious of its own decay. His story forces us to confront the boundaries of control, the moment when human order collapses before the impartial order of death. The empire he built was magnificent, but his end reveals the price of perfection, the inevitable corruption that follows every attempt to rule the world as if one were divine. After his death, the Spanish court carried on its ceremonies, but something fundamental had changed. The aura of sacred monarchy dimmed. Even as the official portraits continued to depict kings as serene and godlike, the whispers persisted that behind the gilded curtains of every palace rot waits patiently. The myth of divine invulnerability had been pierced forever.